if Jews or Christians actually took their faith seriously, then they should land on the conservative side.
Once we get young people into church, into the pews, are we seeing that those young people are then politically activated?
Historically, that hasn't always been the case. Our pastors need to be explaining to their people how important it is to vote their values.
What can non-Christians, such as myself, be doing to support the advancement of Judeo-Christian values? And welcome back to the Brief Insights from the Inside. We are joined today by Christian Collins. Christian is the founder and president of the Texas Youth Summit, teaching young people the importance of conservatism and Judeo-Christian values. Christian, thanks so much for joining us.
It's honored to be on, and I'm excited about this conversation today.
Let's get right into it then. Gen Z is experiencing what is essentially called a generational reversal. They are more religious than their parents. They are more likely than any other age demographic to actually be attending weekly church services. So number one, both as someone who is in this space working with Christian youth, have you seen this anecdotally to be the case? And then number two, what do we think is actually behind this movement?
Well, I can speak from two different standpoints. First, I heard Jake Tapper say this very thing. He said Gen Z is more conservative than ever. And I don't normally agree with Jake Tapper, but I agree with him on that sentiment. And the second thing I can say is just personal experience. With hosting the Texas Youth Summit, I'm founder and president of the Texas Youth Summit, and we had 3,500 young people there. Wow. And we saw a revival. This is the first time we've ever done a Christian worship service, and it was just really powerful. And this was 2 days before Charlie Kirk's memorial. And it was amazing. So many people wanted to come to faith. And in 2 days later, going to that memorial, it was a continuation of that. And so many excited young people just wanting to get back to God in our country. And we've seen church attendance up by 15%. That's the first part of it. And then Bible sales are up 1 million over this point last year.
That's incredible. And I remember being at Charlie's Vigil, and I had said that as a Jew, I don't know what gave that away, the fact that I wear a kippah or the fact that my name is Shabbos Kestenbaum, but as a Jewish person, I think America would be a much better country if more Christians went to church, if more Christians learned the New Testament and the Old Testament and lived a life accordance to the teachings of Jesus Christ. But because you mentioned Charlie Kirk, I guess I'm interested, to what extent, if any, has the brutal assassination of Charlie Kirk led to exactly what you're describing right now of this religious revival in America?
Well, I can just say assuredly that he's made a big impact across the spectrum. And I think young people are more bold than ever now to connect their faith and their politics. And they want to not just call themselves a Christian or a Jew, but they want to be able to defend their ideas. And Charlie Kirk was able to do that in a respectful way. He is what Ronald Reagan referred to as a happy warrior. He fought people, but with a smile on his face. And he did it by giving the other person dignity. He let them have a mic, and he did it respectfully so that they could give their ideas and he would dispute them. It was very civil, always. And there's a lot of people in the movement trying to do what he did, but there really is no one to replace him. But what I can say assuredly is that millions of young people are rising up, and they want to defend their faith and defend their conservative Christian Jewish worldview. And that's important as we're just continuing the legacy that he's left.
Yeah, it's as the saying goes, you can kill a man, you can't kill a movement. And if anything, we've seen this movement explode since Charlie Kirk's assassination. I want to get your reaction. I had said a few months ago, and I got some pushback, that I'm a Jew, and therefore I am Jewish first, and I base my politics, who I'm voting for, based on my Jewish identity. My political identity is very much a culmination of my religious identity. And I'm curious, would it be fair to say that Christians, or in your mind, should Christians, especially young Christians, be Christian first and then base their politics, base who they're voting for, based on their understanding of the New Testament and their religious identity?
Absolutely. And no matter what faith you are, if you just took your faith seriously, you would be so much better for it as a person. But then from a conservative standpoint, if Jews or Christians actually took their faith seriously, then they should land on the conservative side. I would just say that because they'd be socially conservative, and they would understand that these values that we've held dear from the time of our founding are very important.
Right. And, you mentioned conservative a lot, and It's no secret. Let's just address the elephant in the room. There are major factions in the conservative movement today on definitions, on inclusivity. I guess as a leader within the conservative movement, what would your definition be of a conservative in the 21st century under the Trump administration?
Well, I mean, you have the tech bros, you have the Maha folks, you have the evangelicals, you have the old school Republicans, you have the populist, and you have the former Democrats. And learning a little bit about your story, maybe that's where you have come in, just like so many others who have come to our party. And look, we have to continue to keep this coalition together to be able to win elections in the future. And divided we fall, united we stand. And I feel like there are more people that recognize that the Democrats are crazy. They've gotten really, really crazy. But people like Elon Musk and so many others have come to the conservative side because they recognize this is the party of sanity. But if we're going to fight each other, which isn't good, we're going to be divided. And that gives an inroad to the Democrats to win.
Yeah, it reminds me of the line from Reagan where I did not leave the Democratic Party left me. I'm glad you mentioned elections. Let's get into the practical, pragmatic fruitions of politics. You're obviously in Texas. That's where you base most of your conservative policies and actions. There's always talk, and I remember when I was part of the Democratic Party, we were essentially told that we're just one election away from Texas turning blue. It's a purple state. We just need 50,000 more votes. We just need one extra infusion of cash.
Texas turning blue is inevitable. Inevitable. It will happen. The only question is when, Texas?
As someone who's living and active in that state, what is the practical realities of Texas today? Is it a purple state? Is it a red state? And then secondly, what is your organization doing to insist and ensure that Texas remains a red state?
Well, that's a great question. And if you look at where Texas was in 2014 when Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and Attorney General Ken Paxton first ran, we were winning by large margins up to 20 points. Now we're winning by 7 or 8 points. And Democrats can run exciting candidates on their side, and you have all the George Soros money that comes in from out of state. The reality is, though, the real culprit, I think, has been the public school system, which, you have teachers teaching our children these alternative values, and then some of them even work to intentionally deconstruct what these young people have learned from home, and they want them to have leftist values. And so as they grow older, 10, 20 years later, they're voting, of course, and they're in power positions, they're running for office. And that's what we want is young people that are fired up. And by the way, we've even had one marriage at the Texas Youth Summit through it. And so we want young people to get married and have a family. And I think that's the best thing that someone can do to change their life.
Yeah, that is the real reason to be a conservative. The marriage prospects are just infinitely greater. I wanted to ask, I'm glad you alluded to this. Once we get young people into church, into the pews, are we seeing that those young people are then politically activated to then go into the ballot box or go campaign for policymakers that actually fit in accordance to their understanding of Christianity? Or are we seeing sort of what the Jewish community has historically done, whereby we sort of separate our religious identity from our political identity? Are these young people being animated to actually vote?
Well, I sure hope so, but that isn't always the case. And so we need churches to be engaged in the political process. And there was a poll, George Barna understood that only 25% of Christians were voting before, and that improved in the last election, but historically that hasn't always been the case. And so we need to have voter registration booths in every church in America, and our pastors need to be explaining to their people, their congregants, how important it is to vote their values. Because if people just did out of that 9 out of 10 times they'd be voting for the Republican Party. And I know the Republican Party isn't perfect, but if people just voted their values, they would land there. And pastors need to do their job, and we need to be engaged. And so it isn't always the case just because young people are going back to church that they're going to be politically active. But I think because of the life of Charlie Kirk, he was very inspirational. I consider him a Christian martyr. And he really connected faith and politics. So he was one of those influencers. And there's so many others that recognize the importance of connecting your faith and your politics. Because if you are a Christian and you call yourself that, but you're voting Democrat, that's like an oxymoron. How can such a thing coexist? And you have to vote your values.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that Charlie's a Christian martyr, which I certainly agree with, because when young people were asking him questions on college campuses, for example, they weren't just asking about tariffs or healthcare, immigration. They were asking, what is the type of church that I should be praying at? What is the type of woman I should be looking for in a relationship? And I think young people are not just mourning Charlie Kirk, but they're mourning the fact that they sort of implicitly know there won't be another Charlie Kirk again, someone who not only cared about their political values, but also their religious values and their religious strength. So I want to circle back for a moment. As I said, I'm not Christian, I'm Jewish, but I'm very much a believer in Judeo-Christian values, not only ideologically or theologically, but also as a practical political movement that can better our society and better America. What can non-Christians, such as myself, be doing to support the advancement of Judeo-Christian values, both culturally and socially, and also politically?
Well, we've got to figure out ways where we're connected and we're together on most of the issues. And if there wasn't an Old Testament, if there wasn't a Torah, then there wouldn't be a Bible collectively as we know it as Christians. So we need to understand that Jesus was a Jew first and foremost, and that most of the Old Testament is something that most of our Christian brothers and Jewish brothers, we all read.
Well said. I'm a little biased in that department, but I agree with you on that. Let me ask, though, in terms of practical political measures, the Trump administration has put a tremendous emphasis on religious freedom in America. The advancement of the Religious Liberties Commission and its placement in the West Wing is one of the manifestations of that. What would you say are some of the top, I don't know, 2 or 3 practical political pursuits, practical pieces of legislation as it pertains to Judeo-Christianity, as it pertains to the Christian community, as it pertains to religious freedom that you and the conservative movement are focusing on in the next few years and hoping to accomplish?
Well, just recognizing some of the past accomplishments, it was President Trump who moved the embassy to Jerusalem in Israel.
Move the embassy to Jerusalem, making Jerusalem the capital of Israel. They all talked about it. They talked and talked and talked, and then they got into office and they didn't do it.
And it was a lot of presidents who said that they would do that, Republican and Democrat, but President Trump was the only one that followed through. And then as it relates to life, he's the only one that's ever spoken at the pro-life march every January. And of course, Roe v. Wade was overturned by President Trump. You know, that's a huge, he's done many executive orders that have advanced religious freedom. But if we can continue to make sure that it's harder in the blue states, if we can do things from the federal level to ensure that in the blue states, because the red states are doing a lot of good work to limit abortion, but if we can do the work in limiting that from happening in the blue states, if it's education, if it's making sure that the people have the right ideas and they understand how bad abortion is for the woman. It's great for the Planned Parenthood and the doctors, and they're making a ton of money, but it's not good for the woman. And there's a lot of psychological effects. So if the administration can pump, information and education into that, that could be very helpful. I think making sure that we defend life, but also defend religious freedom going forward. But we can never let what happened in COVID ever happen again, where our churches are shut down. And so you had governors in many of the blue states that were doing that. Gavin Newsom, I'm sure he's going to run for president in 2028. He was shutting down the churches in California. And so you had John MacArthur and a lot of people who rose up and spoke out against that. And so we need to ensure that as Christians, we will never be inhibited from gathering ever again. And there are places all throughout the world where religious freedom is not guaranteed. Look at Nigeria, for example. Yeah. You have, radical Muslims going after Christians there, and it's unacceptable. And President Trump has spoken out against that. But, that's happening, though, also in the West. I mean, in places like, London, you put out a meme and you can go to jail. And so that you may not lose your life, but you're losing your livelihood, perhaps, or you're going to jail and you're losing your time and freedom. And so we need to make sure that we have freedom of speech, and that encompasses the freedom of religion. And so executive orders are great, but they're not permanent. So if we can if we can, pass legislation from the congressional level, of course, you need 60 votes in the Senate. We need to pass legislation that makes this final.
Before I let you go, I want to play a quick video for you of what you just mentioned as it pertains to COVID and the resurgence of religious interest that young people have. So let me play that video and then I'll ask for your reaction to it.
When we reopened from COVID, I would say it was our fastest growing demographic. Like, it was kind of instantaneous. We opened the doors the first few Sundays, and I would say the single biggest demographic was Gen Z.
Since the pandemic, the number of young adults at St. Paul's has grown from 45 to nearly 500.
I think COVID gave people a lot of time for introspection. And I think Gen Z is looking around and they're realizing how anxious, lonely, isolated, and fearful they are about the future. And that secularism, its promises of progress and freedom, just simply have not delivered.
So what really struck me about that video in particular is, while it is true Gen Z is the most religious, it's also true Gen Z is the most medicated, Gen Z is the most depressed, Gen Z is the most anxious. So to what extent is this religious revival attributed to the fact that young people were looking for external answers? And they kind of found that really there aren't many answers out there with consumerism or materialism or physicality. And the answers they were really looking for were inside kind of the whole time. Are young people finding meaning? Is that what they're on the search for?
You said it really well. Meaning, or an adjective, purpose. They're looking for purpose more than any other generation I've seen. And they've understood that millennials and, boomers have tried to give them a lot of leftist ideas, going to the colleges and universities where they're not learning what they expected to learn, and they are looking for ideas elsewhere. And going to church, I think, is a great place for them to hone their ideas. And I think, having lived through the COVID generation, and many of them did not get to have a normal high school experience. They had a very confusing time where they were alone and isolated, and perhaps that's why they ended up on prescription medication. For those reasons, they are very conservative, and they've looked for the answers. And there's a lot of people in the conservative movement, or just some of the conservative leaders, especially with young men, that have been influenced by people like Joe Rogan, who are openly talking and dialoguing about their faith exploration. And he's been visiting and going to church. And I think that says a lot. And I can just touch on one thing. I know women have, listened to people like Taylor Swift, and they tend to be going more liberal, whereas young men, they're going more conservative. And so that doesn't really go well for people getting together and having families eventually. But what we can say assuredly is that, having gone through all those experiences, it's shaped them to where they're open to and excited about the conservative worldview. And that's what we need them to be taking in and ingesting.
I'll just add, in defense of Taylor Swift, because I happen to have listened to her last album. She is getting married. At least she can inspire young people to live like a normal life, man and a woman, and have kids. I totally lied. I said though, those were the ends of my question. I have one last question. What can older Americans, I don't want to age anyone, but as Gen Z, as someone who you just articulated, someone who grew up under COVID and took class in their pajamas in their bedroom, what can older Americans who aren't Gen Z do to support young Americans who are on that search for meaning, on that search for purpose? What can they do to help guide young Americans?
Well, if you're a parent, one thing that you could do is have conversations around the dinner table. Actually meet together as a family and have those conversations, and put your phones away and just have conversations. Ask what your kids were learning at school that day. That could be very insightful, and you can know whether they're on the right track. If you can afford to homeschool them or put them in a private school that's faith-based, that would be very helpful to their learning. But a lot of people can't afford to do that, or there just aren't the funds in the state or the laws that enable that to happen. And so in that case, you need to be having very intentional conversations and involved in their learning and taking a good interest in them. You might be an empty nester, a boomer, that's a little bit older, but you have grandkids, or maybe you don't, but you can take time. There's a lot of organizations out there, Big Brother, Big Sister, where you can invest and take the time to mentor and train up a young person, because you may not be able to just influence thousands of people, but if you can change one person's life to that one person, you can be their whole world and you can be their difference maker. So take the time and help someone if you can, and get involved in your youth group at church and make a difference that way if you can. There's a lot of different outlets where you can affect the next generation, but also just pray for them because they have a lot on their plate. They're looking for purpose, they're looking for meaning, and there's so much good in Gen Z. You may be down about, disappointed about the way things are headed in our country, but you can be optimistic about our young people because there's so much good in them and they want to make a difference.
Wow. Christian, thank you so much for taking the time and, more importantly, for everything you're doing to inspire and to help millions of young people across the country. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor.